In Boruto, to reach god status or godhood, you pretty much have to be either an Otsutsuki or Otsutsuki adjacent, which means that there has to be ways to achieve this without of course having the privilege of being born one. Today I will be going over the various ways, both obvious and not, of how you can become an Otsutsuki, starting with the most obvious previously mentioned born one. Right, even though this seems like, pretty much impossible because of how scarce the Otsutsuki are in Boruto and Naruto in the modern times, every single other way involves either having a already born Otsutsuki or something that comes from an already born Otsutsuki, which just by default makes this the much more simple and obvious route. The only pure born Otsutsukis we have seen throughout Naruto and Boruto are Kaguya, Momoshiki, Shibai, Ishiki, and if you want to include filler scenes, then you have people like Urashiki. Now I know that doesn't seem like a lot because it isn't, but that's all we have to work with. So yes, those are the only natural born Otsutsukis so far that we know of. And before anyone comments, we know that you can be a natural born Otsutsuki and they kinda are born by, birth, because when Kaguya comes to Earth, she is able to mate and have sex. That's kind of how Hagoromo and Hamaru were born. So their genetics are very similar to humans, and it doesn't seem like there's a big difference besides them being a race of pale, horned, powerful gods. So yeah, they are born naturally just like humans. And of course, there are a couple symbols in the other dimension that the Ten Tails is hiding in, which we don't quite know who they are, but they are next to Kaguya, Momoshiki, and Ishiki's kind of murals, so we know that they did exist. The next way centers around the plot of Boruto basically, which is karma. Now if you don't know what karma does is it takes the Otsutsuki after they're dead or while they're still alive. In the case of Ishiki, of course, takes their data and downloads it onto the other person. This means that if you were an Otsutsuki and you implanted your karma on a newborn baby, after some unquantifiable amount of time, all of your data would be accessible on that new person, meaning that you can reincarnate onto them at any time. So if you were to die, get in a car accident, or whatever was to happen to you, your body would just automatically upload onto him, meaning the other person kinda doesn't exist anymore. They're kinda dead. So yes, you replace the other person and you become him. It sounds much more gross and nasty than it actually is, like you consuming another person's body to bring yourself back to life, but it is a much less gory theme than how I'm describing it, right? It's just like a puff of smoke and you reincarnate onto that body. Basically the same thing that happened to Ishiki and Jigen. This will turn you into a genuine Otsutsuki because all of the Otsutsuki's data was held within that karma. So even though it used a human as a basis, the human would get overridden by the alien DNA. You would be no different than how Kaguya, Momoshiki, and Ishiki were, because as we know, the Otsutsuki as a race, they use karma to continuously evolve and become updated beings. So for all we know, every single Otsutsuki we've ever met inside of Boruto and Naruto have done karma already, and that's the same as a genuine Otsutsuki. The next way is something that I don't think people really understand that well because it's not as in your face as the karma downloading onto a new person, but it's consuming the god tree or becoming a Ten Tails Jinchuriki. Let me explain. When Ishiki dies out and is explaining to Code how to continue the wheel of the Otsutsuki, he tells him to consume planets and consume worlds, constantly update yourself until you ascend to godhood. Code is someone who is not an Otsutsuki, so this would mean that updating yourself and eating chakra fruits and sacrificing Kawaki and Boruto, like Koji said will happen in the future, turns you into an Otsutsuki, because they are the only beings, at least so far, that we know can genetically update and evolve themselves via consumption. We see this when Obito and Madara absorb the Ten Tails and they start to show characteristics of the Otsutsuki, such as pale white skin, white hair, horns, the ability to fly, truth-seeking orbs, and a plethora of other abilities. So it just seems like if you take in anything from an Otsutsuki, that DNA is so much more powerful than your human one, it just will override you. This is why, like Ishiki said, someone like Code is able to constantly update himself and evolve to become a peerless and unique being. Now this is of course again not outright stated, so it's not stated yeah you'll become an Otsutsuki, but we can come to that conclusion based on not only Ishiki implying it very heavily, but them developing the characteristics of an Otsutsuki that we've seen in every single one. The next one becomes on the more theory side, right? Now there is evidence and merit to this, but I won't really blame you for not accepting it as a genuine Otsutsuki. But it is of course reincarnation. Many people in the Naruto and Boruto fandom consider Naruto and Sasuke Sasuke Otsutsuki by spirit because they inherited the spirit of Hagoromo's two children, that being Indra and Ashura, who are of course 25% Otsutsuki. Because Hagoromo was already 50% Otsutsuki from his mother, he was 50% human from his father, and he married or had a baby with a human mother. Which, if you do the math, you'll come to 75% human and 25% Otsutsuki. Now, of course, Naruto and Sasuke are not 25% Otsutsuki. They're much less in actuality because their parents and grandparents were born hundreds of years after Hagoromo and Hamura, so they didn't quite inherit the DNA of them, but they inherited the soul of them. And as you know, Naruto deals with a lot of spiritual concepts. Even chakra is spiritual in nature, so people consider them Otsutsuki by spirit, which I don't necessarily do because, you know, they're not immune to Ida Senjutsu, which only Otsutsukis are immune to. So it kind of just disproves that theory right there. But I felt I should mention it because a lot of people seem to think so, and a lot of people seem to think that they should have been immune to Ida Shinjutsu. The next one, of course, remains to be seen because we're not that far into Boruto and the Shinju's lifespan, but many theorize that they are immune to Shinjutsu, and when they consume Boruto and Kawaki, they will also become genuine Otsutsukis. Why people say this is because constantly Kashin Koji has told us the very grim futures of the Boruto universe and how it all plays out. And it's always ended with someone absorbing either Boruto or Kawaki and then destroying the planet. You can only do that if Ida dies because her charm ability stops anyone from harming her. Jura also wonders what will happen if he was to consume a fruit, given that he's the Ten Tails himself. Now this makes sense to me because of course if you're going to destroy the planet, you would have to be able to destroy Ida. I mean, it just makes sense, she lives on the planet. But something else that tells me this is just the relationship between the Ten Tails and the Otsutsuki. As we know, the Otsutsuki and the Ten Tails, once they both arrive on a planet, the Ten Tails consumes one of the Otsutsuki partners and becomes a god tree. The other Otsutsuki eats it and then it evolves, right? The only way this evolution would be possible and the only way that this would give a boost to the being is if the Jubi itself had information necessary to evolve a Otsutsuki. We already know Otsutsuki cells override human cells, so much so that absorbing the Jubi or eating a fruit gives you the characteristics almost identical to a genuine Otsutsuki, you know, as we see with Madara and Jubito. So it would only make sense that it's because they are part of the same race. We've seen these kind of parasitic relationships in Naruto and other means of fiction. We see it all the time where like two different beings are kind of dependent on each other for evolution and survivability. So I wouldn't put it past Kishimoto and Ikimoto to kind of implement this into the Boruto universe. This goes right into the next way to become an Otsutsuki, which is just the implanting of cells. We've seen Shibai cells implanted in a plethora of people within the Boruto universe. Every member of Kara, we got Kawaki, and probably much more that just haven't been discovered yet. And almost every time they develop the godlike abilities of Shibai or the god of the Boruto universe. This means that the human side of this person is affected so much so that even if it's used on a corpse, it's able to take the abilities that the corpse had and put them onto a new being. This is essentially the same thing as a karma, kind of like a backup file, but of course it doesn't take the conscience of the dead Otsutsuki. This to me tells me that with enough cells and with enough overriding, you can take someone born human and completely transform them into an Otsutsuki if you have enough cells, and of course if their body can handle it. Now, we don't know exactly how much cells each member of Kara and Ida and Damon have, but I would assume based on the Shinjutsu that each have been able to activate, that Ida probably has the most and Damon has the second most, given how they have just the most broken abilities from Shibai, and people like Code and Kashin Koji have, while, you know, divine abilities, they're just not on the level of omnipotence and reflection. So that tells me that Ida and Damon are just much closer to being Otsutsuki than someone like Koji and Code. This partnered with how also, you know, Ida having the greatest Shinjutsu that we've ever seen, and Damon, since he's a blood relative, him being immune just like the Otsutsuki, it kind of just gives away that, oh, both of them are way closer to being Otsutsuki than Code and Koji because they are affected by Ida's Shinjutsu. Now, kind of piggybacking off of how karma works, we have a way that's karma adjacent, right? You kind of need karma to do it, but it gets rid of the very damning step of karma, which is your body getting overridden. It is if the Otsutsuki, since they need a vessel, decides to, instead of overriding your body, repair your body using up the last percentage of their karma and not allowing them to reincarnate. Whatever Momoshiki did to Boruto, it effectively made him unable to reincarnate reincarnate on that body. So while Boruto will always look like Boruto and will always be Boruto, Momoshiki, if Boruto loses consciousness or if Boruto goes into a Great Depression, would be able to walk around with Boruto's face. This is a much more sinister and kinda gross way of taking over someone's body because no one will ever know. You'll effectively be using him like a puppet, but it still has the same outcome. The Otsutsuki is still able to take over, he's just not able to reincarnate completely. Because as we know, Otsutsuki souls can be extinguished if they don't properly reincarnate in their karma, but the karma is always accessible, like in terms of Kawaki. Even though Ishiki didn't repair part of his body to make him a full Otsutsuki, he still was able to develop and reawaken the karma purely in the form of a weapon, showing that he's still able to access this Ishiki DNA just for himself now. It's almost become Kawaki's Shinjutsu and Kawaki's Otsutsuki powers, because even though Boruto has the stated 100% Otsutsuki label, Boruto and Kawaki are always in the same category, and they both ignore Ida's Shinjutsu, meaning that the story is trying to portray them both as genuine Otsutsukis, even though they have very different ways of being genuine Otsutsukis. Boruto's, of course, comes with more consequences, such as the Otsutsuki still living in your head and trying to take over your body, but Kawaki's comes with the consequence of not being human anymore as well. So they're both effectively Otsutsuki, just in different ways, like I said. The last way would just kind of be true by definition. Like, we have the divine Shinjutsu omnipotence stated to grant anything that you desire, like when her and Kawaki kind of desired the swap between Boruto and Kawaki, omnipotence kind of made it happen. So in theory, if someone desired to become a genuine Otsutsuki, omnipotence would have to kind of, grant that wish. This hasn't been done because, the only users of omnipotence, one doesn't want the power and the other person was an Otsutsuki already. But I mean, for an ability that can craft worlds and basically do anything, this doesn't seem too far-fetched. The last way involves eating a fruit, just like you do with god trees and ten-tails, but instead of eating a fruit made from a god tree, you would just eat the Otsutsuki that's turned into a fruit. Because we see with Momoshiki and Kinshiki that something that the Otsutsuki just have the ability to do is turn each other into chakra fruit. If in theory an Otsutsuki got turned into a chakra fruit and a human ate it, he would be genetically updated with that Otsutsuki's information, just as Momoshiki would have, making it a miniature god tree fruit or a just ten-tails Jinchuriki-esque amp, but it would inevitably change your DNA to a Otsutsuki and make you a genuine Otsutsuki as well. It follows the same concept almost exactly as the god tree and ten-tails route. It's just something I felt I should mention. With that being said, I find it kind of funny how like the Otsutsuki are this godly race, but there's just so many different ways to become a genuine Otsutsuki and just gain their power for your own. It's just kind of something that, I thought would be a fun video to discuss because I never really had a chance to talk about the god tree method of becoming an Otsutsuki. I always just kind of said it in passing in videos, and people were always like, oh, what is he talking about? How do you become a Otsutsuki by a god tree? I mean, Madara and Obito did. They kind of did. So with that being said, again, like, comment, subscribe, and goodbye.